All right, looks like the webinar fully break just has wrapped up, so we'll go ahead and get started, though there may be a few folks joining us in the next few minutes. So I'll just start with a few notes. Just wanted to welcome you all to Reframing Contracts, learn how to write agreements that honor your values and actually help resolve conflict using the conscious contracts methodology. My name is Rose Lavelle. I'm a volunteer on the BLD Planning Committee. I'm also a BLocal PDX board member. I also work at, I'm the sustainability director at a local B Corp, Scout Books. And Scout Books created the program for this virtual conference this year. Some of you may have that. So our speaker for this session is Alexandra Devendra, a founder of Align Law and a Portland-based law firm and an Oregon Benefit Corporation. A few things before we get started. I just wanted to please note that these sessions will be recorded. So by having your camera and microphone on to ask questions, you are giving your permission to be recorded. The session includes breakouts. Those breakout rooms will not be recorded, just the main kind of presentation right here. Let's see, so a few things before, let's see. Please be muted in this main session unless you're asking a question. And we'd love to see your face, so turn on your video if you can. If not, we understand. And Alex will explain this more a little bit later, but we will be using the breakout rooms for this session. So if you and a colleague or you and another person want to be grouped up together for this exercise, you can go ahead and chat me. My name is, it's listed as BLD Rose Lavelle. I'm also the host, so just let me know if you do want to be put together and I'll start creating those breakout rooms. Also, if you're dialing in on the phone, I haven't seen anybody on the list so far, but you might not be put into breakout rooms right away. Just chat me what your name is if you're grouped with the dial-in audio and the video. Okay, great. Well, all right. Alexandra, take it away.
Great, thanks, Rose. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here with you. As Rose said, I'm Alex Devendra. I have a law firm here in Portland called Aligned Law. And I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about my background to help provide some context for why I care so much about this topic. So in a previous life, I used to practice law at a large corporate firm, doing mainly employment law and commercial litigation. And I quickly became disillusioned with that work. In my opinion, litigation rarely, if ever, actually solves the underlying issues that cause the dispute. And even on the employment advice side of my practice, it bothered me that a lot of the labor laws we're working with were written close to 100 years ago. And when we applied them to 21st century workplaces, you can get a lot of negative unintended consequences. And then on top of that, I was also really put off by the toxic work culture at the law firm. So I actually stopped practicing law for a few years and started doing management consulting essentially for law firms instead, kind of in the vein of how could we create better working relationships among lawyers so that they can better serve their clients. Because there's a lot of unproductive behavior that goes on in law firms. And kind of that work led me to study organizational design and development and to try and figure out how to address that toxicity. And that's how I started to get involved with a lot of the different future of work movements out there. So not only the B Corp movement, but also kind of self-management trends, Teal, the Zebras Unite group here in Portland. And what I realized is that there's already so many businesses out there doing this good work and trying to make their organizations more healthy and sustainable. And instead of trying to convince lawyers to change, I could have more of an impact if I went back into practice myself and focused on serving the folks who already get it and helping them actualize these new ways of working from the legal perspective. So where contracts comes in is that I believe they're one of the tools we can use to support this paradigm shift. Before I was introduced to conscious contracts specifically, I had a general idea that we could improve how contracts are written so that they can actually serve as a communication tool. And I happened to meet a big New York City corporate lawyer at a friend's wedding, and I was telling him about this idea. And he just stopped me and said, why would I want the other side to read the contract? My goal is to get them to fall asleep by the fourth page. And I was really kind of taken aback by that reaction. And I think it really illustrates the deep divide between how we as a culture think about contracts and the potential they have to become something better. And I'm just noticing my neighbor's running a leaf blower. Can you guys still hear me all right? Okay, good. If it becomes loud, maybe Rose, you could send me a chat. Anyway, the plan for today is I'm going to give a brief overview of why I think we need to reframe contracts and how conscious contracts can give us some tools to do that. And then, like as Rose said, we'll pair you off for a breakout so you have a chance to actually use the tools yourself. And I think we'll have about 15 minutes for that. And then we'll reconvene in the main room here. And I'm hoping some of you may want to share an insight or a question that arose during your one-on-ones. Yeah, and as Rose said, if you came here with someone you know, or if you're here with someone you work with and you want to do the breakout with them, just send Rose a chat and she can try and pair you up. So let me just bring up my slides. I'm gonna see if I can get the leaf blower to stop. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up, Rose? You can see my screen. Great. So I think the place to start is at the very beginning. What is a contract?
Oh, just a heads up, Alex, it looks like a little bit different from when we tested it out. There's a timer and then a current slide and a next slide button.
Strange. Are you still seeing the speaker?
Oh no, it's all good. You're set.
Okay, so yeah, so let's start at the beginning. What's a contract? The dictionary definition is that it's a legally enforceable agreement. Okay, so how do you make a legally enforceable agreement? You just need three things: offer, acceptance, and consideration. And consideration is just means something of value is exchanged between the parties. So for example, hey, do you want to buy this apple? I'll sell it to you for $1. And the other person says, sure. That's a contract. You don't even need to write it down. We just made a legally enforceable agreement. There was an offer, there was an acceptance, and something of value is going to be exchanged, an apple for $1. So that's really all a contract is. It's pretty simple. Of course, we can make it complicated. We can add terms to address all sorts of possible scenarios. When will I get the apple? Where will I get the apple? Will the money be due before or after you give me the apple? What if I don't like it? Can I get a refund? And so on and so on. But it can get kind of exhausting to think through all those permutations, and it's not really practical to do that for every transaction. So we end up relying on the default terms that someone else has written. And these things are everywhere, operating in the background of our lives, our credit card agreements. I don't read those. The terms and conditions for all the websites and apps you use. Who really reads all of that? And even when it's not a mass consumer thing, even when it's something more personal, I think we're so accustomed to not reading the contract or thinking that we have no negotiating power that even when the opportunity is there, we just don't take it. And so I wanted to share an example of that. There was a newish consulting company, and they were starting to get some traction and get some pretty big projects. And they got this one high dollar contract, but the first phase of the project was going to require some skills that they didn't have on their team internally. And so they decided to subcontract that out and essentially bring in another consultant to help with that piece. And they knew they needed to have a written contract with her, but what they gave her was just some totally generic, off-the-shelf independent contractor agreement. And I think I understand where they're coming from. You know, they're a small shop. It's not like they have an in-house attorney. And they're also younger, so they may not have personally experienced the consequences of having a poorly written contract. So they just didn't know better. So what happened is that the subcontractor, she knew she needed something more tailored in place. And so she hired me to revise the contract. And we spent a lot of time really thinking through, you know, what are the contours of phase one? What are the deliverables? How will you navigate the client relationship? You know, let's get clear on everyone's roles so you all can look good in front of the client. So she took these changes back to the agency and they said, okay, good. They signed it. The project started. Well, she gets a little ways into it and realizes that they never read her revisions. So there was still a huge disconnect between them about what her role actually was, what they wanted her to do, how much autonomy and client contact they wanted her to have. And when she told me what had happened, I just felt so bad. It felt like such a missed opportunity. So how do we break out of these old patterns? How do we shut off the autopilot and start paying attention to what our contracts say? How do we normalize talking about these things on the front end so as to avoid conflict down the road? And if a conflict does arise, is there a way to work through it without having to end our relationship? And I think part of the answer is just about awareness. You know, awareness that a contract is a really flexible tool. It's just meant to memorialize what you're actually trying to accomplish. So just say what you mean. You know, and I think this can help make it easier to talk about too. You know, if you're using a traditional contract, it feels like you're shoving legalese in the other person's face, and that is not a good feeling. But if you approach it as, you know, hey, I just want to make sure we're on the same page about things, and I've written it down in plain language, you know, what I think our plan is, can we go over it together? You know, and that just sets a different tone for the relationship. So how do we make this shift? How do we start writing contracts in this more accessible way? This is where conscious contracts can provide us some tools and guidance. Conscious contracts is simply a new methodology for writing contracts. And it's based on the book Discovering Agreement by Linda Alvarez, who I've had the pleasure of working with and also learning the methodology from her. And in the book, Linda talks about using the contract to provide both a frame and a framework for the relationship. And I'll just interject here that this is one of the things I like to emphasize about this shift is like the shifting to the relational aspect. You know, because I think we're moving from a traditional mode of thinking about the transactional nature of a contract, and now we're looking at that relational aspect of the contract, because that's really what it is when you think about it. If you have a contract, you're in a relationship with the other person. And that means we have to make room for our humanness, and it means we have to think beyond this specific transaction that we may be documenting to the broader relationship and how we can tend and nurture that over the long term. So back to frame and framework. These are really the two keys of the conscious contracts approach. So first, you have to give a little attention to your frame. The contract is not happening in a vacuum. Each of you brings your own intentions, goals, and values to the relationship. And it's worth acknowledging those, you know, explicitly, and making sure you're on the same page. In conscious contracts, we call this the touchstone statement, but it's basically just writing down your mission, vision, values. And doing that first before you start pinning down other contract terms, because your touchstone will help inform, you know, what the other contract terms should be. So, you know, if one of your goals is to make your product widely accessible, that may mean offering a wider range of payment terms than you might otherwise put in a contract. And I recommend putting it right up front, you know, right at the beginning of the contract. Like, this is the reason the two of you are doing business together in the first place, this alignment of values. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on touchstone because I think folks who are drawn to a B Corp conference probably already have quite a bit of experience with mission, vision, values exercises, and that's really all this is. I'll just say that sometimes when you do this, you'll discover that you and the party aren't in alignment. And I've seen it happen where they decide not to move forward with the deal. Or like in the co-founder context, sometimes they realize they're not actually on the same page about what they want to get out of the business, and they decide to just remain friends and not become business partners. So that can be disappointing, obviously, but in my experience, those are also the cases where folks are most grateful. They say, we're so glad we discovered this now, discovered this misalignment before we sunk all our time and money into the project. So the second part of the equation is creating a framework. And really what that means is, how are we going to navigate this relationship when circumstances change or when conflict arises? And I think it's important to just call out here, it's normal for things to change, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes quickly. COVID, anyone? And also conflict is not bad. It's not necessarily something to be avoided at all costs. It happens even among people in a strong relationship, and the key is just having a way to work through that in a healthy way. Personally, I think those are two kind of no-brainer statements. Things change, conflict happens. But when you look at how we've traditionally approached contracts, we don't really seem to acknowledge those truths. You know, first we try to address every contingency up front, which is why contracts can be so damn long. Do we as lawyers really think we're smart enough to predict every possible future outcome? And then when things don't go as planned, you know, instead of talking it through and maybe making a reasonable modification, it's, oh, well, that's a breach of contract. That's not what we agreed to. Tough cookies. But there's a different way to handle things. And in the book, Linda calls this framework addressing change and engaging disagreement. Kind of leaning into the disagreement and finding your way through. Other folks use other terms to talk about this. I've heard harmony clause, but basically the idea is putting something in the contract that says, hey, if we feel a tension arising, we're going to talk about it. And that might be uncomfortable, but we're committed to seeing if there's a way we can work through this conflict without blowing up the whole thing. And here's how we're going to do that. And importantly, this is a requirement before pursuing other legal remedies. So in a way, you could think of it as like an informal dispute resolution process that has to take place before you can proceed to mediation or arbitration or whatever comes next. And it can be unique to you. So if you know how you tend to respond to conflict, you can try to account for those foibles. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you know, there's lots of assessments out there. There's the TKI conflict style assessment. I, for one, will admit that I tend to be accommodating. So that means I will put up with a lot before I speak up. And you can see how that might cause problems in my relationships if I'm just kind of letting things fester. And each style has its own things that you have to watch out for. Like for a compromising person, they kind of start negotiating with themselves in their head before things even get started. So they've probably already made concessions because they're anticipating what they think is the middle point where things will end up. So that can work against them too. So what does this actually look like? Well, here's a harmony clause from a contract. This was a co-founder agreement. And they're basically laying out exactly how they're going to have the conversation. They want to schedule it at least a day out so that they have time to do individual reflection before they talk about things. And then they gave themselves these list of questions to reflect on. I don't know if you can read it, but it's things like, you know, what do we appreciate about working with each other? What outside influences might be affecting us? Are we each still getting what we anticipated? That kind of thing. So why might this be useful to B Corps? Well, as you know, part of being a B Corp means considering the impact of your decisions on all the various stakeholder groups, your workers, customers, suppliers, etc. And in a lot of cases, you will have written contracts with these stakeholders. And if you use conscious contracts, you'll have a way of ensuring not only that your values are baked into the agreement and will help guide it, but also that if and when you face a difficult change of circumstance or even an outright conflict with a stakeholder, that you'll have a way of navigating that tension in a way that will hopefully preserve the long-term relationship and not subject yourselves to the really adversarial legal system, which kind of forces you to each play a role where you're at odds with each other, instead of looking for that win-win path. So that was your crash course in conscious contracts. For the breakout, what we're going to do is pair you off, and I'd like to invite you to do a little role playing with your partner. So pretend the two of you are negotiating a contract and you want to start roughing out this framework for having difficult conversations. So maybe if you have some awareness around your conflict style, you can talk about that. How the two of you approach conflict. Is it similar or different? What procedures could you put in place to help balance out your natural style? And then see if you can come to agreement around any of the following things. How will you initiate a difficult conversation? Will it be email, sending them a calendar invite, phone call? Is there any particular phrase or content that would be preferred? For example, I had two clients that the way they were going to communicate to each other that they were sensing a conflict was that they were going to say, "I sense a disturbance in the force." So you can make it, to suit your personality style if you're a little bit irreverent. And then thinking about how to frame the conversation. How will you ensure that you stay in alignment with your touchstone? How will you try and ensure that you're actually doing reflective listening and able to hear one another? And then, what happens if you need support? Is it okay for one or both of you to bring another person to the conversation as a support person? And what will happen if you can't reach a resolution at the end of the conversation? What's the next step from there? Is it take a break and try and have another conversation? Is it proceed to mediation? Is there something else that might happen? So those are the prompts for the breakout, and I'll paste these in the chat if I can. And then Rose, are you ready for that?
Yes, we're ready. And I just wanted to mention, I have two folks to a breakout room assigned now, but if you enter the breakout room and after about 2 minutes, if the person doesn't enter with you, then come on back to the main room and I'll reassign you to a room. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and open up, or I'm going to let Alex paste them in the chat for everyone to see, if possible, or we can.
I put them in there. Can you see them?
Yes. So I'd invite everybody to copy those right now, because once you leave this main room, you won't be able to see this main room chat, just so you have it. And if you have questions while you're meeting with your partner, you can go ahead and raise your hand and Alex will be available to drop into any of those breakout rooms. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms now, and you'll get a 60-second warning when we close the breakout rooms. We're all going to come back together and reconvene afterwards. And Alex, how long do folks have? You may have mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to say 15 minutes, but maybe we'll shorten that a little bit just to make sure we have time for reflection.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms.
Great. Thank you all for sticking with it and doing a little role playing. I would love to just hear if anything interesting came out of your conversations, whether a personal insight or a question I can answer. How did it go? Let's see, maybe while you're thinking of that, I did get a question from Monica about how you would do this with employees if you don't have a written employment contract with each of your employees. And I was saying how you could kind of take the framework piece and turn it into a policy, like here's our workplace policy about how to have difficult conversations with each other. So there's things you can do to kind of modify it, even if it's not a strict contract.
Something that came up in our conversation was around relationships being more important than the contracts, and it's hard to define a relationship in a contract because they're so fluid.
Yeah. And especially if it's like between businesses, right? Like the contract might be with a company, but then there's like the people that are kind of the face of the company or the relationship manager, and those can ebb and flow over time too, even if the company itself hasn't changed. So did you, I'm curious, was there a specific example or any thoughts you all had about how to address that?
We didn't have a solution to necessarily, but I can think of a couple that maybe around defining how we have good relationship within a contract. So changing a contract to a more how we are going to have our relationship defined in a good way rather than defining what happens if it doesn't work.
Yes, I think that's a really important point, because that is often how contracts are written. It's like, here's all the ways this could go wrong and what we're going to do in each of those cases, and not very much about how to make it go right. Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
And it looks like we have a question in the chat from Sash. One question that arose for us is how to get buy-in from another party who may not see the value in spending time up front with the conscious part of the contract.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've definitely, I've worked with companies where they were very much bought into this and they wanted to do this with all of their vendors or joint ventures. And yeah, the people on the other side may or may not be as enthusiastic about it. So, I guess that tells you something. If you're really into this and it's important to your mission, vision, values, maybe the fact that people aren't willing to give it a try is telling you something about the alignment or lack thereof. But you could also just, it doesn't have to be the full-fledged, oh, here's our touchstone statement, but you can at least kind of bring that ethos to your side of the contract negotiation and kind of surreptitiously start to work on this a little bit. And sometimes it's easier to start with, do it with a contract where you already know the other person and know they're going to be okay with this, and get some practice doing it in kind of lower stakes settings before you like foist it on a complete stranger.
I had a quick question about the contracts, and it seemed I was coming at this more from, how to rewrite a contract for new clients, as an example. So what would be the best way to go about, revising a current contract for services or a service-based digital social media agency here in Portland? And what's the best way to rewrite a contract for future new clients that incorporates all of these aspects, mission, vision, values, and everything that you shared?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would take almost like kind of like a design thinking or like a human-centered design approach. Maybe you could do a little bit of kind of exploration with existing clients about kind of how, did they actually read your contract? Did they have a reaction to it? Are there things they were looking for that were missing? And try to get some feedback about the status quo. And that might give you ideas for like, oh, we could actually make this more user-friendly if we created a one-page summary of the important key terms instead of making, instead of having like a really long, dense document, or, out of just other insights that might come out of your particular use case. Well, I see we're almost out of time, but I'm also happy to answer questions offline or afterwards if anyone thinks of another question after this. But it was my pleasure being here with you today. And I do have a handout. I'm not able to upload it in the Zoom chat, but I'm going to send an email through Sched. So if you had pre-selected this breakout in Sched, you'll get that email.
Thank you so much, Alex. I just want to thank you on behalf of everyone for speaking with us today, and sharing a little bit of your expertise. I know these sessions go pretty quickly, so and thank you everyone for joining us too. If there are more questions, we can definitely stay on for a few minutes. Next up on the schedule on the webinar is the dance break. So I believe there will be some more music by DJ Manny Fresco. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in the chat, but maybe Alex and I will stay on for another minute or so just to see if there's any more questions. So feel free to stay behind if you want to chat more. And otherwise, we'll see you at the rest of the conference.
Great. Bye.
And you can always access the schedule through sked.com on your profile to see what's next if you can't tune in to the next dance break session. But we'll hopefully see you tomorrow or for the rest of the day and for tomorrow. So feel free to enter your questions or unmute yourself if you have any more questions for Alex.
Alex, I have a question.
Yeah.
In our company, I thought this was a great session. I got blessed enough to be with Amanda in the breakout. So whoever did that, thank you. It was awesome. But my question is, when we write contracts, I'm from Unstoppable Conversations, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And when we write contracts, we often, when we listen to people, to our clients, we're listening to the pain points that they will have, so what they want. And then we have a list of promises, like things that we promise that we give them. And this is what really happened. We ended up listening to a client, putting the pain points of what she wanted out of for her company, what she wanted out of the proposal, and she was so upset, I guess I would say it that way, upset that we actually put that in part of the contract, that I thought, one of my thoughts were that we probably should have warned her ahead of time how we actually put together. We put what they want based on what they really, really want, and that often is a pain point for them. And do you have any advice on setting clients up so that they're not like concerned, hurt, like upset with taking their language and putting it into a contract?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I wonder if there's a way to, just a couple of ideas that come to mind, if you could create like a sample contract with fake client information and share that with people before they engage, so that they can see an example of like, this is where this is going, and this is how your vulnerability might show up on the page. Or I don't know if this would actually help, but if there's a way to structure the document so that it's like on a schedule or it's referenced, like we're gonna have a pain point exploration document, and that's incorporated by reference, but it's not actually in the the official part of the contract. If that would have like provided a little bit of a buffer for her, I don't know if that would have helped.
I think that'd help, but my head's trying to catch up. Can you just say that point again? Because I think it's really important.
Structure, like literally how you structure the pages of the contract, either putting that information at the back, like on an exhibit, or even just referencing it as a separate document. Like the contract says, we've put together a separate pain point document that summarizes your pain points, and that's on a separate PDF, and it's not technically part of the contract, but it's referenced.
That is a great idea, so that she or he or whoever it is, don't have to be concerned about the vulnerability that they display. So they can either keep it or.
Yeah, it might depend on like who ends up ultimately seeing which of these documents. So I don't know if it would really solve her issue, but that was just one idea.
Oh, those are great. I appreciate that. Thank you. It's like literally why I came to this session.
Oh, thanks for
discover
being here.
that. So
yeah, I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you. I'm taking it back. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you again, Alex. It's great to hear. I'm excited to take some of this back to my work, and yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for everyone for sticking around, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Hopefully I'll see you all in another session.
Yeah, thank you.
All right,
Bye.
take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.